Welcome back to the Weather Center, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining me today. It is Tuesday, January 30th, 2024. I have some new information to pass along in terms of this bowling ball-like cyclone that's expected to break away from the polar front jet and move through the southern tier United States into the southeast, potentially creating flash flood conditions once again, as well as a high wind threat over the next 5 to 7 days. I've also been seeing a lot of comments and a lot of information floating around the YouTube and the weather community entirely concerning whether or not we'll get some wintry effects or snowstorm impacts for the mid-Atlantic states. So we're going to kind of rummage through that a little bit and dispel any kind of misinformation you guys may have happened across. Before we get started, please like and share this video and subscribe to the channel, or at least consider subscribing if you're brand new and just finding this information, guys. I will be back on a repetitive basis providing you with these crucial updates to keep you weather aware and in the loop in terms of what Mother Nature is anticipated to throw at us. With that being said, thanks again for tuning in. Let's go ahead and get started. Now, as we begin the video, our main area in question is right here over the south and southeast United States. This is going to be our next low-pressure cyclone, if you will, that is anticipated to dip across the Four Corners area, the desert southwest of the U.S., and not only provide that area with heavy rainfall, especially as it moves through California. You can see even at this point in time, we are expecting yet another atmospheric river-type setup with another low-pressure storm expected to move in towards the Bay Area of California, but lots of widespread heavy snow accumulation for a lot of our higher terrain features of the central and southern Rockies. Before I get in depth with explaining the nature of this system, I want to kind of discuss exactly why this is just a little bit more difficult to forecast and why I don't think we're actually going to see as textbook of a severe weather outbreak or as textbook of a winter storm effect to the north of where this system kind of parades through. If you remember yesterday, and I'll kind of talk you through it, we have a very sharp amplitude ridge that's over top the central portions of the United States, ridging into central Canada all the way up into the northern Canadian territories. And as such, we have lots of warm air coming out of the south, kind of entrenched over the heart of the United States, really not allowing for any of that cold air to come down further to the south. The reason I have our 1,000 to 500 thickness pulled up is this identifies that very well. And if you look, it might be a little faint for you guys to see. Our blue thickness values indicating colder temperatures are up over the northwest, as well as up to the extreme northeast United States, really not delving too far to the south. And I'll go ahead and erase the ink before this chart becomes a conglomerate of mess. But essentially, we have all but warm air across a large majority of the U.S., with our cold air more or less trapped up into the western Canadian provinces in the extreme northeast U.S., where it looks like our polar front jet is trying to swing down to the south, providing us with what I've heard is considered a 50-50 low, helping to try to funnel down a little bit of cold air. Now, what's very interesting about this system is if you look towards the center of circulation, we have one spherical thickness value of 546 decameters. And in layman's terms, what that means is as it is broken away from its supporting polar front jet, it has now lost that IV feed, that drip, if you will, of cold air provided by our polar front jet and the baroclinicity associated with it. Because really where the polar front jet comes from, as the name implies, is that great temperature discontinuity on the north or the poleward side of it and the equatorward or southern side of it. It is extreme difference of temperatures, and that's why we have that acceleration in the winds with a little bit of the angulation of the spherical Earth providing us with that acceleration in our winds. So since this feature is entirely broken off, we're not going to have that traditional cold or dry conveyor to the north of it and that warm conveyor to the south, helping to create that widespread threat for severe weather along the leading edge and that wraparound moisture effect where it runs into that rain-snow line and we get that abundant feed of heavy snowfall. As you take this further through time, you can see it does remain moving off to the east-southeast, and eventually, once it exits the southeast U.S., it becomes a big problem for Bermuda in way of heavy winds and heavy rainfall, and it doesn't really draw in too much of that cold air. So I do believe, all in all, we're really not going to see any sort of winter storm effects. We really won't see a whole lot of snowfall with this, outside of maybe the higher-most terrain influences to the very westernmost extent of North Carolina and up into Virginia, where I do think we'll see the mountainous snowfall or that light dust to give the mountains that snow-capped look. In my very humble opinion, I do think that our gradient winds and our flood risk is going to be the greatest threat with this system. As I rapidly take our European model through time, you can see across the southeast quadrant of the U.S., our average thinking by all the models, and this is echoed across the GFS, the Canadian, and the ICON, we could see on average 2 to 3 inches of rainfall, if not exceeding that area or that threshold in some localized spots, county by county, if particularly in southern Louisiana, unfortunately impacting the Mardi Gras shenanigans shenanigans you guys have going on this weekend, as well as southernmost Mississippi and maybe getting into Alabama. And I won't show you guys just for the sake of keeping this video shorter in length, but we do have very good precipitable water values over an inch, if not almost upwards of 4 to 5 inches in some very isolated areas as the system transitions through the southeast, which does mean that the atmosphere itself is capable of producing very heavy rainfall in short periods of time. We just have that much of an influx of moisture, moist air advection occurring that could create quite a bit of heavy rainfall in very short bouts, which is why WPC, which I'll show you here in a moment, actually does have the Gulf coastline highlighted for that risk of flash flooding once again. So as I'd mentioned previously, we have that marginal risk for excessive rainfall throughout much of eastern Texas and getting into Oklahoma. And then if you transition over to day 5, there's our slight risk potential, our level 2 risk of seeing flash flood conditions envelope parts of south and southeastern Louisiana, the extreme southernmost extremity of Mississippi, and then trying to slowly but surely get into Alabama. And we may continue to see that yellow threshold continue to slide further eastward, considering we are now at the very tail end of this loop. You can see we are on the day 5. Doesn't go farther than this point. So tomorrow we'll have to investigate if that continues to transition. One phenomena worth noting is the winds, and I really haven't seen very many people mentioning the wind speeds we could see with this. Now, since it is a cut-off low, what that also means is it's going to have its own envelope or its own shroud of jet energy still left over from when it left the polar front, and it will re-intensify once it begins to interact with our El Nino subtropical jet. So I do think a gradient wind event is in effect for a large majority of us living in the deep south, the Dixie Alley area, and the southeast, to include the greater Florida Peninsula. This chart is currently valid for 18Z on February 4th, which is just around the lunchtime hour. As I mentioned yesterday, this is going to be as we're getting out of church, if you guys partake in church on Sunday mornings. As we step outside parts of Alabama, Georgia, and the eastern and western portions of Florida, both coastlines, if you will, thanks to that lack of a frictional impact to our wind flow, could be anywhere between 35 to almost 45 knots, thanks to the gradient associated with this system, not only at the surface as our surface reflection begins to intensify, but that upper level low that will be spinning and slowly propagating across our AOR. What does grow slightly concerning is if you take this loop maybe about 12 to 24 hours further out in advance, you can see as that system does meet up with our subtropical jet and begins to interact with that anticyclone aloft associated with higher and lower pressure down at the surface, our pressure gradient force is only going to increase over the Carolinas, the mid-Atlantic coastline, as well as for some of our folks down there in the Yucatan and the westernmost extent of Cuba, and you may even feel some of the effects of this system as far south as the Cayman Islands, Jamaica, and into the Bahamas, maybe even trying to get into Haiti. If you look right in through this corridor here, though, we have very, very good northeasterly flow, almost onshore flow for the Cape Hatteras area and further to the south out of North Carolina into South Carolina, winds almost gusting all the way up to 55, if not 60 knots before this low can push far enough offshore to no longer pose a sensible threat to you guys that live along the coast. So we can definitely expect, if you live right up along the beach, we're going to see some very, very gusty conditions as we roll through Monday and into very early morning Tuesday. This is also going to include very dangerous, life-threatening rip currents, good beach erosion, very typical of what we would see with these kind of low cyclones planted off the coast, almost reminiscent of a tropical system. So we definitely want to make sure we stay away from any kind of coastal activities, beaching, fishing, boating, as the system begins to move through. We are also looking at the chance of seeing some isolated severe weather thanks to that amplification we could see because of the Gulf Stream waters running along the coastline like so in this orientation. And as that onshore flow continues to buffet you, you're also going to have to deal with winds, but also very heavy rainfall in short periods of time. Now, before we continue the video, I know we're on Google and we're looking at Google Images, but for those of you who don't reside in the Carolinas or are not too familiar with the topography of the Mid-Atlantic, the Appalachian region, I'm showing you what an image of North Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia looks like to show you where I'm anticipating if we do get snowfall out of this system. If we manage to get a little bit of that cold air out of the north to move in far enough to the south, it will likely only be higher terrain snowfall, maybe coming in at 1/4 of an inch and maybe up to about an inch at the uppermost peaks of these Appalachian Mountains. And as I'd mentioned before, I have our 850 and our 700 millibar temperature advection charts up in front of me here so I can show you guys exactly what I meant by how we're not going to have those trademark conveyors associated with this system because it isn't entirely jet supported. It isn't entirely baroclinic in nature where we have that leading edge severe threat, that uppermost quadrant snow, wraparound snow and wintry precip effect, and then that cold plunge coming along the backside of it. As you scroll through time, this is Friday going into Saturday. You can see our system system beginning to finally show face over the southern and central plains, and already you can see we really don't have an abundant area of warm air or cold air advection associated with it. And as you take this further through time, you can see a little bit of that onshore flow in a weak low-level jet trying to establish itself over the western coast of Florida into the Panhandle, Alabama, and Georgia. But again, nothing in terms of what we've seen with these previous actual bona fide winter storms. So we will see a little bit of cooler air drawn in behind it, very, very modified continental polar air. And naturally, because of how robust and warm the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico are, alongside those very warm sea surface temps, we will get a little bit of warm air advection or almost just modification of our atmosphere and our environment as this slides through, thanks to that counterclockwise rotation around the low. If you come up to 700 millibars, I already have the clock stopped Monday, very early morning, and you can see we actually have almost uniform temperature discontinuity around all sides of it, which means this system is barotropic. There isn't a textbook dry sector, cold sector, or warm sector. We actually have a little bit of warm air entrenched on the backside of it, warm air scooting around the southern periphery of it, as well as warm and cool air trying to wrap around the eastern half of it. We're going to very rapidly go through some ensembles, and then we'll close out the video. And as you can see on our GFS, this is going to be our instability. I'm looking at instability first because I've been very thoroughly investigating whether we'll actually get any severe weather out of this outside of just heavy rainfall and high gradient non-convective winds, or winds not associated with our thunderstorms. As it stands currently, it does look like eastern Texas into Louisiana and Arkansas, as this really does begin to show itself over the south, could see a risk for some lightning and thunder activity in association with the showers and storms that will develop. Very low-end risk of severe at this time, and as this transitions through the south, it does look like we could see a bit of modification, as I previously mentioned, out of the Gulf through the Yucatan Channel up towards the Florida Keys, the west coast of Florida, before this system interacts with the Gulf Stream off the east coast like we typically see, and as we have seen with our last few systems, producing some tornadoes in the Port St. Lucie area, Stuart, Florida region. And as you continue through time, it looks like a lot of that instability is going to stay offshore. So in fact, if you do get any kind of activity or shower activity down towards the Bahamas, I do think we could see some convective winds. We could see a very light water spout, if not only a funnel cloud potential, depending on how organized these individual cells stay, thanks to that influx of warm advection down to the south being pulled out of the Caribbean Sea. This here is going to be our 24-hour snowfall, courtesy of the European ensemble from 0Z last night. And as you transition through time, you can see that heavy snow threat for the upper terrain features the highest points of the Rocky Mountains, through the Mogollon Rim of Arizona, the upper periphery of New Mexico, the Front Range of Colorado, as expected, because again, since it is a cold pocket breaking away from the polar front, our coldest air is actually going to be up above the surface at between 850 to 500, if not 300 millibars, because it's going to draw some of that polar front energy as it moves away from the jet supporting it. As you take this through time, you can see a lot of the snowfall really dissipates with this low, and as I showed you guys with that topography map a little bit ago, because of that colder air aloft as opposed to down at ground level, any kind of precipitation that does encounter those mountains are also going to help in terms of that mechanical lift moving up the slope of the mountains, moving into that freezing point, and will come down as snowfall. So if you live in the mountains, you definitely have a better chance at seeing a little bit of that snowfall you're hoping for, or maybe not so hoping for. It depends on your taste and what you prefer, but it does seem like this is going to be a higher terrain event. We're really not going to get a lot of that snowfall mixing into our majorly populated or urbanized areas in North, South Carolina, or even up into Virginia. So same thing with our National Weather Service blend of models. Unfortunately, the short range ensemble, or the SHREF, does not go out far enough to see whether or not the mid-Atlantic states are going to see snow. But even the National Weather Service blend of models, which is a National Weather Service ensemble product, doesn't really give a huge vote of confidence in terms of our snowfall for Virginia, West Virginia, parts of North Carolina, and even trying to get into South Carolina. So unfortunately, for those of you who were looking for that snow, in my opinion, I really don't think we're going to get it. We might see maybe some very, very light flurries that try to come down as that cold core system, relatively cold core system, transitions through your area. But if you really want to see snow, you're going to have to travel to the mountains, go up those peaks, and really finally take advantage of where the snow could be coming down because of a combination of different mechanisms, that wraparound moisture interacting with the higher terrain features being lifted mechanically or forced up the ramps of the side of the mountains or the sides of the mountains, acting like a ramp. And that's what could bring us into that freezing air, that freezing line, and come down as very light snow between maybe a quarter to a half an inch to maybe upwards of an inch the further up you go in elevation. And last but not least, before we close out, I just wanted to show you guys what WPC once again is thinking in terms of what we could see in terms of our wintry precip, snow, sleet, freezing rain out there for the mid-Atlantic region. And even they are giving it maybe between a 10 to 30% shot of occurring over the highest portions of the Appalachian regions if you live in the Carolinas or into Virginia. So all across the board, despite what some may be saying, I don't give the snow event a very high vote of confidence either. And going back to what I mentioned at the beginning of this video, since this is a different type of system, this isn't a traditional baroclinic low or a comma cloud-like feature with the separate sectors of warm, cold, dry air associated with it, we're not going to have the same sort of effects with it. We're not going to have the same type of phenomena, which for those of you who are returning viewers of mine, if you hearken back to Tropical Storm Ophelia, why I seem very adamant going against the grain and not identifying it as a tropical system, because believe it or not, classifications do matter. And if you classify a system one way or another, that communicates to you guys, the general audience, that we're likely to see this versus actually realizing this. And in this case, because this is a barotropic, modified, cool/warm core system as it interacts with our subtropical jet, we just don't have the same driving forces that would traditionally provide us with a heavy snow winter storm-like influence. But alright folks, we're closing out the video. Thank you very much for those of you who tuned into my video yesterday. It feels good to be back at the helm providing you guys with this weather content, and I do promise once again we'll be very much more habitual about providing you with these crucial updates, especially as we begin to transition out of the winter time over the next 30 to 45 days. We hit that transition season through March, and then eventually tornado and hurricane season will be upon us. So we definitely want to keep the video coverage going. We want to develop some more momentum as we get closer and closer to what could possibly be some very dangerous weather events ahead. We're looking at going live tonight at 8 p.m., guys, so if you have the spare time Tuesday tonight at 8 p.m., please come join us for Weather Center Live. We'll talk all about this and get into the finite details as you wish, and I'll answer any and all questions you may have to the best of my ability. But until next time, guys, again, thank you very much for watching. We'll see you soon. This is Weather Center Nazario, signing out.